There are a lot of little intricacies to the weapons in Monster Hunter. And the fact that people are still talking about whether or not Deviljho will eat his own tail, something that the community took for fact for half a decade, makes me think that maybe it's time we go back to the basics and do some myth busting of our own. Monster Hunter is a complex game, and there are copious amounts of information that gets spread around, be it true or false. I'm a lance guy, so this video is going to focus specifically around the lance weapon. But if you guys like myth busting, tell me in the comments and we can spread the myth busting further afield. Either way, I hope you enjoy the video as we bust some myths and clear up some misconceptions. So first up, can you block Valstrax's sound barrier breaking dive bomb? And can you block Flaming Espinas's mega fireball? Let's start by working from the ground up. Firstly, there are loads of attacks that we normally can't block, but we can with certain conditions. The first and most obvious one is attacks that need guard up to block. Things like Rajang's laser beam or the almighty Roggy hip check. We can test the dive bomb and the fireball with guard up, and yeah, the attack breaks through our shield. So let's move further up the chain. In previous games, there were grab attacks or grapple attacks that would get you even if you blocked the attack. But those grab attacks have been changed or fixed depending on your point of view, and now we can block those attacks in Sunbreak, and neither the dive bomb or the explosion really feel like grabs either. But there are still some attacks that you seemingly can't block against. A couple of Geismagorm's attacks will hit you regardless of how much guard and how much guard up you bring to the fight. And the reason why this is the case is because right before it hits you, it tremors you. So if you bring tremor resistance to negate the tremor, you can block the attacks normally. Valstrax and Flaming Espinas, on the other hand, don't seem to tremor you, and bringing other sort of skills of that nature also don't seem to allow us to block the attack. Maybe it's simply because we don't have enough guard levels to prevent the stamina decreasing and like breaking our shield. So if we try stacking Embolden 3, Guard 5 and Guard Up, and then applying Twin Vine to get the extra effective guard levels on top of that, it's still not enough to block the attack. We could even use the Furious skill to give us infinite stamina, and we can't block the attack. And at this point, we're running out of options, and the myth is looking pretty strong. The main contention with this is that the dive bomb and the explosion are blockable by other weapons, but not by lance. However, the crucial thing here is that when people talk about them being blockable by other weapons, what they really mean is counterable, and it's a different thing. It's the same reason why the longsword could foresight slash through Rajang's grab attacks in Iceborne, while the lance couldn't block it. The dive bomb and the explosion have a special property that makes them bypass someone guarding. So yeah, myth confirmed, you can't block them, but you can dodge them. Next up is a strange one. If you already know the answer, you're gonna wonder why it's here in this video, but I'm surprised by the number of people that I've seen parroting this around. Does hopping backwards give you more iframes than hopping forwards? I'm not fully sure where or why this idea has popped up, but no, I can confirm that back hops have the same iframes as front hops. I can sort of see where the idea is coming from, as back hops are sort of kind of a better option if you want to dodge things, because it's going to cover slightly more distance. So if you're not very good at timing the iframes, the extra distance from the back hops are going to make the iframes that you have more forgiving at dodging. It's a bit of a confusing concept, so I'll try put a graphic on the screen or something, but to put it simply, think of the enemy attack as a sweeping projectile. It's going to go from one end of the screen to the other, and if it touches you, you get hit. Your iframes essentially makes you able to phase out of existence for a brief second, allowing the sweeping projectile to pass over you without you getting hit. The amount of iframes that you have isn't changing, but you can still decrease your likelihood of getting hit by the move or by the attack while iframing. If you move towards the attack, you're effectively increasing the speed that the attack will pass by you, making you need less iframes to evade the attack, because the number of iframes, or the number of frames where the attack is on top of you, or where you would be, is less. Another way of looking at it is by imagining if you did the opposite. If you dodged away, you're effectively increasing the time where the hitbox of the attack is overlapping you, which means that you need to have a better timed dodge, or in some cases, simply more iframes to avoid the attack, as there are now more frames where you and the attack hitboxes overlap each other. So let's bring this back to hopping around with the lance. It's sort of true to say that back hopping, and to a greater extent the super back hop, is going to be better at dodging attacks than forward hopping, assuming that you're always hopping into the monster's attack, as the back hops cover more distance, but it doesn't do that by increasing your iframes. And the back hop has such a small extra distance compared to the front hop that it's almost negligible. But does that make the myth busted? I'd say yeah. There is an interesting bit of nuance, but the iframes are the same either way. Skyward Thrust is a move with really high DPS, if you can line up all the hits. But one of the biggest problems, other than actually getting all the hits to land, is that it is so darn dangerous to use. The end lag of the attack will, more often than not, lead you to getting hit by the monster's follow-up attacks, especially if you're using it willy-nilly instead of specifically against certain monster attacks. So this myth is, can you cancel the end lag of Skyward Thrust? So the first thing is to check if we can shorten the end lag by dodging or attacking. It seems like using our normal pokes or just trying to hop out of the latter half of Skyward Thrust doesn't seem to help us get out of the move early. But that's sort of expected. The go-to option for shortening end lag is normally guard dash. And as a general tip, if you're in a pinch and you need to get to your guard as quick as possible, guard dash is normally the way to go. Using guard dash does seem to have a bit of an effect on the end lag of Skyward Thrust, and I'll display the amount of time it saves around here-ish. However, there is another, far stronger method of shortening the end lag of Skyward Thrust by using terrain to your advantage. Positioning yourself by a ledge will allow you to completely remove Skyward Thrust's end lag, granted you stand in the right spot. The trick is to make sure that your lance lands on a higher elevation to where you land after the lance swings you back down onto the ground. And when you're in the training room with the infinite wire bug setting turned on, it's quite funny to see the speed of skyward thrust that you can reach. However, in terms of hunt effectiveness, it's still a nice trick to have, as it's going to let you punish monster attacks that you would otherwise not be able to, but that's assuming that you're already in position near the ledge and that the monster is playing ball by wandering over and giving you that weak spot access. I don't doubt that we'll be seeing someone make some crazy clip using skyward thrust in this way, but it's not going to be super useful for everyday hunting. But is the myth busted? I'm going to go ahead and say no, as you can cancel the animation early using ledges and to a certain extent with guard dash, but I'm not sure how practical or game-changing it's going to end up being. The next myth is quite an interesting one. Do different lances have different lengths of attack reach? So on the face of it, it's very unlikely, but there is a certain level of precedent, enough precedent that we ought to check at least. Firstly, our sister weapon, the gun lance. Very excited that they're getting some love in the next title update, by the way. But the gun lance has been plagued by different weapon models having different attack reaches. One of the gun lance attacks sends out a little spike from the tip of the gun lance. And depending on which gun lance model you're using, the spike will be launched from different points on the gun lance, which causes different attack lengths per weapon. Now, lance doesn't have anything similar that gets launched out of the weapon, but there are other games in the series where weapons have different variables of length, namely Monster Hunter Frontier. So, at the very least, it's worth testing to see if lance has any funny business going on. So, I went to the training room, back hopped a few times, and then mid-thrusted repeatedly until I landed a hit on the training dummy. And then I repeated that with a bunch of lances, and I can confirm that the number of mid-thrusts that it takes for each lance to reach the training dummy is the same. I also did the same thing for charged wide sweep. If you let it charge all the way, then it takes exactly the same time for one lance to hit compared to all the others. But the weird thing is that when timing the charge to maximize the speed of it coming out, I found that using certain lances, I was able to get it out a little bit faster than with others. There was a really small variance in the time that it takes to hit, so you've got to take this with a big pinch of salt because I'm timing the charge myself, so some variation is always expected. But the really strange thing here is that there is about 5/60ths of a second variance between different lances. Individually, when I'm charging the lances to do the charged wide sweep, I have a variation of around 1/60th of a second, or rather, I am accurate to about 2/60ths of a second in charging the wide sweep. And that's the same across all the lances that I've tested. But with some of them, I was hitting 5/60ths of a second earlier than others, which is weird. Again, take this with a pinch of salt, especially as it doesn't seem to affect the end lag of the move, meaning that functionally you're going to be getting the same number of hits per second. It's just that it shifts those hits earlier within the cycles by about 5/60ths of a second. Either way, very weird. We'll leave this one as inconclusive as we need to do more testing on it. Moving on, the next myth is the idea that when you hit the monster with the lance, the game will look at both the cutting and blunt hit zones and then choose whichever one is more favorable to give you damage numbers. So this myth is pretty simple to see on the face of it, as now that we can see damage numbers in game, it's very easy to debunk. But its origins are kind of interesting. So to break the format, this myth used to be true, but isn't anymore. In the mystical period of the older games, full of exotic monsters and low polygon counts, is a version of Lance that would hit both blunt and cutting hit zones. That's kind of vague and a little bit confusing or misleading. So let me explain how that works. Firstly, the lance has always done cutting damage. With the lance itself, I'm ignoring that we can bonk things with our shield. And by cutting damage, I mean that the lance, when you poke, will always cut tails, and it will never break off things like Baroth's scalp. However, Lance used to have a special gimmick in that it would look at both the cutting and blunt hit zone values of wherever you're hitting and choose the better one when determining damage. But it also wasn't as simple as that either. The game would take the blunt hit zone and reduce it by about 28% and then determine whether or not to use the cutting or the blunt hit zone value. So if we use Lagiacris's back as an example, it has a cutting hit zone of 24 and a blunt hit zone of 40. So when you poke Lagiacris's back with the lance, the game would look at the 40 and the 24, and then because the 40 is a blunt hit zone, it would times that by 0.72 to get the value of 28, and then it would use that hit zone to compare to the cutting hit zone, which is 24, and then it would decide to use the blunt hit zone of 28 for the final damage calculation. A very confusing thing to do, especially if you can't see that with damage numbers. And unfortunately, it was a nifty gimmick for the lance, but it never really had much use, as most of the hit zones that it did actually help were never hit zones that you would want to hit in the first place. So if you guys are playing the older versions of Monster Hunter, don't worry about it too much. Speaking of, if you guys want to see content about the older games, mention it in the comments below. I'd love an excuse to go back and revisit some of the older stuff. Back to the future, and we can test hit zones in Sunbreak to prove that the piercing damage is no longer a thing. Daimyo Hermitor, I'm gonna butcher that pronunciation, but the red crab's shell has a similar hit zone value to Lagiacris's back. 22 as a hit zone for cutting weapons and 40 for blunt damage. So we can input our set or our weapon into a damage calculator, and using the two hit zones, or the two hit zones once the 40 has been modified to a 28 hit zone, we can get two different expected damage numbers. And then it's as simple as running up to the crab and poking his shell to see which damage number pops up. And with that, the myth is busted. Or at least, it's busted in Sunbreak, as I'd kind of like to see the feature return. Ideally, I'd want it to be useful, which would require a lot of hit zones to be rejigged, but that might make the game less fun when using other weapons as a whole. So maybe it's more trouble than it's worth. And with that, we've come to the end of the video. I had a lot of fun figuring out the truth behind these myths. So if you've got more Monster Hunter myths of your own, I'd love to hear them. Maybe we can make another video about it. If you liked the video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video. And if you're interested in seeing more, why not subscribe? And you could always check out my other videos as well. But most importantly, I want to thank you for watching. See you next time.